Do you ever come across a set of speakers that sound pretty good, but the wood cabinets are all messed up? Scratches, holes, stains, just general sadness? Today, rather than looking at the electronics inside, I want to show you what I usually do to clean up the wood on these things that actually only costs a couple of bucks and can be done in an afternoon. So stick around, because this is one of those quick and dirty fixes that's actually really easy and a lot of fun to do. This is a pair of Utah AS-2AX bookshelf speakers that I found a couple of weeks ago at a thrift store. They're from the mid-60s, if I'm not mistaken, and they still sound pretty good. Now, when I say good, what I mean by that is that they sound the way that they're supposed to sound. I'm not that impressed with the overall tonal, sonic experience, but we'll get into that later. I do, however, love the way that they look, specifically the wood cabinets. Now, when I found these for the astronomical price of $10, the wood was not in the best shape. It was all scratched up and somebody had drilled some holes in them to mount them to the wall in what I'm guessing was their garage. Since I did the other two videos about repairing the internals of old speakers, I thought it might be helpful to show a cheap way to make the outsides look a little bit nicer. And these seemed like the perfect candidates, so I had to bring them home. But before I show you what I did, I need to make some things clear. Number one, I know even less about wood repair than I do about electronics. Those of you who are familiar with my content will understand the substantive void that that statement implies. But number two, and much more importantly, this is a channel dedicated to learning as I learn new things, and hopefully inspiring other novices to try some simple hands-on fixes. That's why I think it's important to stress how new to this I am, because it means if I can do this, you absolutely can do this too, regardless of your skill level. That's the whole point. So the first problem was the drill holes. To deal with them, I used Minwax wood filler. Now, full disclosure, I didn't buy that stuff and I don't know how old it is. I just borrowed it from my parents since they live across town. They had two colors, walnut and golden oak. The walnut seemed a little too dark and the golden oak was a little too light, so I decided to just mix them and the color ended up pretty close to what I was looking for. After I applied the filler to the holes, those fillers have to dry, and as they do, they lighten a little bit. As soon as they were just dry enough to become crumbly, I went in with a razor blade and removed the excess so there wouldn't be as much sanding necessary. I also stuck some in one of the larger gouges on the front because it was bothering me. While the wood filler was drying the rest of the way, I figured I should address the stains on the other sides. There was a water stain on one of the sides, and I don't even know what the other one was. My guess is something with iron in it. I'm not sure. My understanding is that you can use oxalic acid to remove iron stains, but I don't have any, and I was trying not to have to buy anything for this video, so I just sanded it since I was going to be doing that anyway. The speaker cabinets are made from particle board, but they used a walnut veneer, which can be sanded down. You just have to be extremely careful because it's really thin. I used an orbital sander because I've got one, but this could be done by hand if you're patient and you don't have one of those. I will say that tools are one of the most common and inexpensive things that you'll find at garage sales, at least in my experience. So if you need one for a single use, that's an excellent place to look for them. I used these neat little mesh sanding pads, 400 grit so it wasn't very aggressive. I also covered the speaker cloth so it wouldn't get dust on it. Then it was just a matter of gently and patiently sanding down the surfaces until the stains weren't so visible. That was enough time that the filler had dried and I was able to go in and sand those sides as well. While I was working on this, the wind and dust got a little out of control. We get a lot of dust storms here in the desert, so I packed up and moved into the garage and continued sanding the sides. I had to be careful with the thin veneer, but I did manage to get rid of most of the scratches and marks. Once all the sides had been cleaned off, I was ready to use one of my favorite products, Restor-A-Finish. It's similar to the Old English scratch cover that I've used previously. Unfortunately though, if you just slap it onto something as scratched up as these were, you'll still see those scratches, which is why it was convenient that I was sanding them. Normally, they don't expect you to sand things. Now, this was my favorite part. Once the wood was clean, I applied the Restor-A-Finish to the wood. That was a very satisfying thing to watch. The beautiful walnut color comes out immediately. It's like you're rubbing iridescence directly into the wood. To be fair though, any similar product would do equally well. I've used Old English a few times like this, and the results have been just as nice. In fact, I would argue that Old English is a little bit better because it has no odor. I did the top and the two sides of each of the speakers, then gave the front bezel a quick once-over and left them to dry overnight. And, of course, there was the ever-crucial step of peeling the masking tape off. Satisfying. But this is the result. After a couple of days of drying, I think they look pretty good. Under the studio lights, the scratches are barely visible, and the stains are completely gone. And the color is holding up really well. Overall, I'm very happy with the results, and it was really easy to do. Once I got these back into the studio, I wanted to try to clean up the hookups. To do that, I had to unscrew the back panel. There isn't much of a crossover, just a capacitor soldered in line with the tweeter wire. Once the speaker wires were all disconnected, I was able to lift the back panel off. Then I could unscrew the board from the wood and pull the whole thing out. I desoldered the capacitor and soaked the whole thing in a mixture of vinegar and distilled water for a few seconds. The vinegar and water bath works almost immediately. Just dip and scrub. I gently hit it with a wire brush, then rinsed it and let it dry. Distilled water probably isn't necessary. I just have a bunch of it because I use it at work. Then I soldered on some new Dayton audio capacitors because I had them lying around and reassembled everything. For reference, the wires attach like this: green, red, brown, and black. All right, so now that I've got them at least presentable, let's talk about them a little bit. Interestingly, the Utah company was based out of Huntington, Indiana for a bit, though I believe it was actually started in Utah when they were making radios. Later, they manufactured speaker sets and drivers for not only stereo systems, but guitar amps, most notably Fender. In fact, the baskets on these 60s Fender speakers that I found online look remarkably similar to the baskets on the speakers that I have here. The owner, Francis Pyle, went on to create the Pyle Audio brand after the Utah company didn't exist anymore. If you've seen any of my speaker videos in the past, you know that I'm a sucker for old speaker cloth, and the combination of black and brown weave on these I find especially appealing. It's in great shape too. No cuts, no stains, and it's remarkably clean for something that's probably 50 years old. The front grille does not come off. The cloth is stretched over and attached to the actual panel that the speakers themselves are bolted to, so you don't have the option of displaying these without the cloth on the front. One thing I find interesting about the construction is that the 4 outside body panels have the veneer on the inside as well as the outside. Also, I think it's interesting that they only used 4 studs on the woofer to hold it in place. If we look at the back panel, there's a cool old paper card that has the company logo, the model number, and acoustic speaker suspension system written in big bold letters. Just below it is where the hookups are. You have the option of bare wire screw terminals, or under this neat little rubber protector is a single RCA jack. Now, according to what I found online, these have a power rating of 12 watts, which doesn't seem like a lot, and it's not, but for what it's worth, I was able to get more than enough volume out of them to annoy my neighbors without getting any distortion. As far as the actual sound goes, I'm honestly not that impressed. The woofer is trying to handle the whole range, and the tweeter is way too quiet even with the new capacitors. They sound okay-ish with old recordings, but they really struggle with anything contemporary. But I also didn't buy them for the sound. They're just cool looking, and I wanted to experiment with cleaning up the wood a little bit. All right. So let's look at the cost for a second. The speakers were $10 at the thrift store. Everything else I had lying around or I borrowed. But if you wanted to buy it, the Restor-A-Finish is about $10 at Home Depot. The Minwax wood filler would be another $10, and the capacitors were a little less than $4. While I did sand these on all sides, that wasn't necessary. You could just hit the wood filler with some basic sandpaper, which is usually less than $10. I've even seen it for sale at the dollar store. I sanded the whole thing because of the stains, and because it's way more dramatic when I apply the Restor-A-Finish. Satisfying. So that's the Utah AS-2AX bookshelf speaker and my very low budget attempt to clean up the wood. I have no real woodworking tools, nor the space to house them. But at some point, I would love to get together with someone who does actual carpentry so I can see what would go into refinishing a set of cabinets properly, or even building new ones. That would be a fun collab video. So I'll see you guys next time, and as always, throw up the horns and stay metal.